The morning fog hung thick over London as Queen Camilla adjusted her pearl necklace one last time before stepping into the black Bentley. She had no idea this would be the last time she would travel as a free woman. The investigation that had been quietly building for months was about to reach its shocking conclusion. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell had been working on the case for over a year. What started as a routine audit of royal charities had uncovered something far more sinister. Financial records showed millions of pounds being diverted from children's hospitals and homeless shelters into private accounts. The trail led directly to the Queen Consort's office. Sarah remembered the moment she first realized the scope of the scandal. She was sitting in her cramped office at Scotland Yard, surrounded by boxes of documents, when her assistant knocked on the door. "Ma'am, you need to see this," he said, holding a bank statement. The account belonged to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. But the signature on the authorization forms was unmistakably Camilla's. The evidence was overwhelming. Forged documents, fake invoices, and a complex web of offshore accounts all pointed to systematic theft from royal charities. The Crown Prosecution Service had been reluctant to move forward, but Sarah's persistence had finally paid off. The Attorney General himself had signed the arrest warrant just hours earlier. Meanwhile, Camilla sat in her private study at Clarence House, reviewing the day's schedule. She was supposed to attend a charity luncheon for disadvantaged children, the same charity from which she had allegedly stolen funds. The irony was not lost on those who knew the truth. Her private secretary, James, knocked softly before entering. "Your Majesty, there are some gentlemen here to see you," he said nervously. "They say it's urgent." Camilla looked up from her papers, annoyed by the interruption. "Can't it wait? I have the luncheon in an hour." "I'm afraid not, ma'am. They're from the police." The color drained from Camilla's face. She had been expecting this day for weeks, ever since her lawyer had warned her that investigators were closing in. But she had hoped her position would protect her, that the establishment would find a way to make the problem disappear quietly. Detective Inspector Mitchell entered the study with two uniformed officers. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times. But facing the Queen Consort in person was still surreal. "Your Majesty, I am Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell. I have a warrant for your arrest." Camilla stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly. "On what charges?" "Fraud, theft, and money laundering in connection with the misappropriation of charitable funds totaling approximately £8 million. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Camilla's carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. She thought of Charles, who was away on a state visit to Australia. She thought of her children and grandchildren, who would have to live with the shame of her actions. "I need to call my lawyer," she said quietly. "You'll have that opportunity once you're in custody," Sarah replied. "I need you to come with us now." As they walked through the grand corridors of Clarence House, staff members stopped and stared in disbelief. Some of them had worked for the royal family for decades and had never seen anything like this. The housekeeper, Mrs. Williams, began to cry as she watched her employer being led away. The media had somehow gotten wind of the arrest. As they emerged from the building, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Camilla kept her head down, trying to maintain what dignity she could. The headlines would be brutal, she knew. The monarchy would never recover from this scandal. At the police station, the processing was swift but thorough. Fingerprints, photographs, and a formal reading of charges. Camilla sat in the holding cell, still wearing her designer dress and pearl necklace, looking completely out of place among the concrete walls and metal bars. Her lawyer, Sir Geoffrey Hamilton, arrived within the hour. He was one of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in the country. But even he seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case. "The evidence is substantial, Your Majesty," he said grimly. "We need to prepare for the worst." The news broke across the world within hours. BBC interrupted regular programming with a special bulletin. CNN led with the story. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from shock to satisfaction. Many people had never liked Camilla, still viewing her as the woman who broke up Charles and Diana's marriage. Now, they felt vindicated in their suspicions. Back at Buckingham Palace, Emergency meetings were being held. The palace press office was in chaos, trying to craft a response that would minimize damage to the monarchy. But there was no spinning this story. A sitting queen consort had been arrested for stealing from charities. It was unprecedented in modern British history. King Charles was reached by secure phone in Sydney. Those who were present said he aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His wife, his partner for decades, was facing criminal charges that could send her to prison for years. The coronation, which had taken place just months earlier, now seemed like a distant memory from a different lifetime. The investigation team worked through the night, building their case. They had traced the money through multiple accounts and several countries. The pattern was clear and deliberate. Over a period of 5 years, Camilla had systematically diverted funds meant for the most vulnerable members of society into her own accounts. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a financial crimes expert at Cambridge University, was brought in as a consultant. She had seen many white-collar crimes in her career, but the brazenness of this operation shocked even her. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, she explained to the prosecution team. This was planned, systematic, and showed complete disregard for the people these charities were meant to help. The Children's Hospital in Manchester had been forced to close an entire wing due to lack of funding. The homeless shelter in Birmingham had to turn away dozens of people every night because they couldn't afford to expand. Meanwhile, Camilla had been using the stolen money to fund a lavish lifestyle that even her royal allowance couldn't support. Evidence emerged of expensive jewelry purchases, luxury vacations, and payments to exclusive spas and boutiques. The prosecution team built a timeline showing that major expenditures often coincided with large withdrawals from the charity accounts. The case was airtight. As news of the arrest spread, protests began forming outside Buckingham Palace. Some supported the monarchy, holding signs that read, "Stand by the King." Others demanded the abolition of the royal family entirely. End the monarchy, and justice for all became common chants. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued a statement calling for prayer and reflection. The Prime Minister held an emergency cabinet meeting to discuss the constitutional implications. For the first time in centuries, the very existence of the British monarchy was being seriously questioned by mainstream politicians. Camilla's children from her first marriage released a statement through their lawyer, distancing themselves from their mother's actions while expressing their love and support for her as a person. It was a carefully worded attempt to protect their own reputations, while not abandoning family loyalty entirely. The charity workers who had been directly affected began speaking to the media. Margaret Thompson, who ran the Children's Hospital, broke down in tears during a television interview. "We trusted her," she said. "She came to our events, cut ribbons, made speeches about helping children. All while she was stealing from the very children she claimed to care about." International reaction was swift and harsh. The Commonwealth nations, many of which had only recently acknowledged Charles as their head of state, began discussing whether to maintain their ties to the British crown. Australia's Prime Minister called it a betrayal of everything the monarchy claims to represent. In her cell, Camilla barely slept. The weight of what she had done, and what was about to happen, pressed down on her like a physical force. She had grown up with privilege, married into ultimate privilege, and now she was facing the possibility of spending her remaining years in prison. The next morning brought no relief. Her lawyer arrived early with updates that were all bad. The media coverage was wall-to-wall negative. Public opinion polls showed that 70% of Britons wanted her to face the full force of the law, regardless of her title. Even traditional monarchist newspapers were calling for justice. The prosecution team was preparing their case with unusual speed. The evidence was so clear that they were confident of a conviction, but they knew the defense would try every possible delay tactic. Sir Geoffrey was already filing motions and challenging procedures, hoping to buy time for the initial shock to wear off. But time was not on their side. The charities that had been robbed were demanding immediate restitution. The families affected by the reduced services were organizing class action lawsuits. The scandal was growing larger by the hour, not smaller. Detective Inspector Mitchell received a call from the Crown Prosecution Service. "We're moving forward, with formal charges, immediately," the voice on the other end said. "The public interest demands swift action." Sarah hung up the phone and looked out her window at the crowds gathering outside Scotland Yard. History was being made, and she was at the center of it. A Queen consort was going to stand trial for theft and fraud. The British establishment was about to face its greatest crisis in generations. As the morning sun broke through the London fog, it illuminated a changed nation. The arrest of Queen Camilla had shattered illusions and forced uncomfortable questions about power, privilege, and accountability. The monarchy that had survived world wars, scandals, and social upheaval now faced an enemy from within. The stage was set for a legal battle that would captivate the world and potentially bring down one of the oldest institutions in human history. But first, Camilla would have to face her victims, her family, and a justice system that she had always believed would protect her. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. The world would be watching as a queen faced a judge, not as royalty, but as a common criminal. The very foundations of the British constitutional system were about to be tested in ways no one had ever imagined possible. The Old Bailey courthouse had never seen crowds like this. Thousands of people lined the streets, held back by police barriers and mounted officers. Some carried signs supporting the monarchy, others demanded justice regardless of titles. The atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation as the most sensational trial in British legal history was about to begin. Inside the historic courthouse, every seat was occupied. International media representatives sat shoulder to shoulder with legal experts and curious members of the public who had won the lottery for courtroom access. The press gallery buzzed with nervous energy as reporters prepared to witness history. Queen Camilla entered through a side door, flanked by prison guards. Gone were the designer clothes and sparkling jewelry. She wore a simple gray dress and looked older than her years. The transformation from queen consort to defendant was jarring for everyone present. Some spectators gasped audibly when they saw her. Judge Margaret Thornton, one of the most respected judges in the British legal system, called for order as she entered the courtroom. She had presided over many high-profile cases during her 30-year career, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The very future of British democracy might depend on how this trial was conducted. The prosecution team was led by Sir Marcus Webb, the Crown prosecutor who had built his reputation on complex financial crime cases. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that every word would be scrutinized by millions of people around the world. The evidence was overwhelming, but prosecuting a queen consort required absolute precision. Sir Marcus stood to deliver his opening statement. His voice was clear and strong as he outlined the charges. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about theft. Plain and simple theft. The defendant, regardless of her title, systematically stole £8 million from charities meant to help the most vulnerable members of our society. He walked the jury through the evidence methodically. Bank records, forged documents, and a paper trail that led directly to Camilla's personal accounts. He showed photographs of the children's hospital wing that had to close, the homeless shelter that turned away families in need, the elderly care facility that couldn't afford proper medication. The defendant lived a life of unimaginable luxury while stealing from sick children and homeless families, Sir Marcus continued. She attended charity galas and made speeches about helping others while simultaneously robbing the very organizations she claimed to support. This is not just theft. This is betrayal on a scale that defies comprehension. The defense team, led by Sir Geoffrey Hamilton, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence was clear and damning. Their only hope was to argue that Camilla had been misled by advisors or that she had mental health issues that affected her judgment. It was a desperate strategy, but they had few options. Sir Geoffrey's opening statement focused on Camilla's years of genuine charitable work and suggested that she had been manipulated by unscrupulous financial advisors. He painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by the complexities of royal finances and taken advantage of by people she trusted. But the jury seemed skeptical from the beginning. The evidence was too clear, too deliberate, for claims of confusion or manipulation to be believable. Forensic accountants testified that the theft required sophisticated knowledge of international banking and careful planning over several years. Margaret Thompson, the director of the Children's Hospital, was the first victim to testify. She described how budget cuts had forced them to cancel surgeries for sick children. She broke down in tears as she explained how they had to tell parents that treatments weren't available due to lack of funds. "We trusted her completely," Margaret said, looking directly at Camilla. "She visited our hospital, held babies, promised support. We had no idea she was stealing from the very children she claimed to care about." The homeless shelter director, David Park, testified about families sleeping in cars because they couldn't expand their facilities. He described elderly people dying from exposure because they couldn't afford to heat more beds. His voice shook with anger as he recounted how Camilla's theft had directly led to human suffering. Social worker Amanda Reynolds testified about the impact on vulnerable families. She had worked with children who couldn't get necessary medical treatments because the hospital couldn't afford them. She had seen families torn apart because support services had been cut due to funding shortages. The prosecution called witness after witness, building a picture of widespread suffering caused by Camilla's actions. Each testimony made the human cost of her crimes more real and more devastating. The courtroom was often silent, except for the sound of people crying as they heard the impact of the theft. Financial expert Dr. Elizabeth Warren explained the complex money laundering scheme in detail. She used charts and diagrams to show how money had been moved through multiple accounts and jurisdictions to hide its origin. She testified that this level of financial sophistication could not have been accidental. The defendant clearly understood exactly what she was doing, Dr. Warren explained. The pattern of transactions shows careful planning and deliberate concealment. This was not confusion or mistake. This was organized criminal activity. FBI agent Robert Chen, who had helped trace money through American banks, testified about international cooperation in the investigation. He described how Camilla had used diplomatic immunity and royal connections to open accounts that would normally require extensive documentation. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell testified about the investigation and the moment of Camilla's arrest. She remained professional throughout her testimony, but there was obvious satisfaction in her voice as she described building the case that brought down one of the most powerful people in Britain. The defense called character witnesses who spoke about Camilla's years of charitable work and her dedication to various causes. But their testimony seemed hollow in light of the evidence of theft from those same causes. Several witnesses appeared uncomfortable, as if they were beginning to doubt their own words. Dr. Patricia Knowles, a psychiatrist, testified that Camilla showed signs of depression and anxiety that might have affected her judgment. But under cross-examination, she admitted that mental health issues did not excuse criminal behavior, especially criminal behavior that required such sophisticated planning. The trial's most dramatic moment came when the prosecution played secretly recorded conversations between Camilla and her financial advisor, Marcus Sterling. The recordings clearly showed Camilla giving specific instructions about moving money and creating false documentation. "Make sure this can't be traced back to me," Camilla's voice said clearly through the courtroom speakers. "If anyone asks, this is a private donation from an anonymous source." The defense team objected to the recordings, claiming they were taken without proper authorization, but Judge Thornton ruled them admissible. The impact on the jury was obvious. Several jurors shook their heads in disgust as they heard Camilla's own words confirming her guilt. Public opinion outside the courthouse continued to shift dramatically. Protests grew larger each day, with some calling for the abolition of the monarchy entirely. Opinion polls showed support for the royal family at its lowest point in history. Even traditional monarchist strongholds were questioning whether the institution could survive this scandal. King Charles remained in Australia for most of the trial, unable to face the daily humiliation of his wife's criminal proceedings. Palace officials released carefully worded statements expressing sadness about the situation, while maintaining appropriate distance from the legal proceedings. The international implications became clearer as the trial progressed. Canada's parliament voted to begin discussions about removing the British monarch as head of state. Jamaica announced plans for a referendum on becoming a republic. Australia's Prime Minister called for a new constitutional convention. Inside the courthouse, the prosecution methodically destroyed every element of the defense strategy. They proved that Camilla had not been manipulated by advisors but had actually been the driving force behind the scheme. They showed that her mental health was stable throughout the period of the thefts. They demonstrated that she had sophisticated knowledge of financial instruments and international banking. The evidence of Camilla's lavish spending was particularly damaging. Credit card receipts showed purchases of jewelry worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. made within days of major transfers from charity accounts. Hotel bills from luxury resorts around the world coincided with large cash withdrawals from stolen funds. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a handwritten note found in Camilla's personal safe. The note contained account numbers and transfer amounts, written in her own handwriting. The defense tried to argue that the note might have been planted, but handwriting experts confirmed its authenticity. The prosecution's final witness was 10-year-old Emma Williams, a patient at the Children's Hospital whose surgery had been canceled due to budget cuts. Emma testified via video link from her hospital bed, describing how she had to wait months for treatment because the hospital couldn't afford the equipment they needed. "I was scared I might die before they could fix my heart," Emma said in a small voice that filled the silent courtroom. "Mummy said we had to wait because there wasn't enough money to help sick children anymore." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom as Emma finished her testimony. Even some of the defense team appeared moved by her words. The contrast between this sick child and the woman who had stolen her treatment money was stark and undeniable. Sir Geoffrey made a final, desperate attempt in his closing argument to paint Camilla as a victim of circumstance who had made terrible mistakes but didn't deserve prison. He appealed to the jury's respect for the monarchy and suggested that destroying Camilla would damage Britain itself. But Sir Marcus's closing argument was devastating. He systematically reviewed the evidence, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the crimes and the suffering they had caused. He reminded the jury that no one, regardless of title or position, was above the law. The defendant sat in palaces while children slept in cars. Sir Marcus concluded, "She wore jewels, bought with stolen money, while elderly people died from cold because homeless shelters couldn't afford heat. This is not about the monarchy. This is about justice for the victims of systematic, deliberate, calculated theft." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim and determined. The foreman, a retired teacher named John Mitchell, stood to deliver the verdict. "On the charge of theft, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered. Others gasped in shock. Camilla showed no emotion, sitting perfectly still as her world collapsed around her. Judge Thornton called for order, but it took several minutes for the noise to die down. Outside the courthouse, the crowds had been following the trial on large screens set up by news organizations. When the guilty verdicts were announced, the cheering could be heard for miles. Cars honked their horns, people hugged strangers, and impromptu celebrations broke out across London. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week, but the guilty verdicts had already changed everything. For the first time in British history, a queen consort was a convicted criminal. The monarchy that had survived for over 1,000 years faced its greatest crisis ever. As guards prepared to lead Camilla back to her cell, she finally looked up at the gallery where victims and their families sat. The pain and anger in their faces was unmistakable. She had stolen not just money, but hope and healing from people who had trusted her completely. The guilty verdicts sent shockwaves around the world. Emergency sessions were called in Commonwealth parliaments. Religious leaders called for reflection on power and responsibility. Historians compared the moment to the execution of Charles I and the abdication of Edward VIII. But for the victims in the courtroom, the verdicts were about more than history. They were about justice finally being served to someone who had thought herself above the law. As they filed out of the courthouse, many felt that their faith in the justice system had been restored. The stage was now set for the final act of this unprecedented drama. A convicted queen consort would face sentencing, and the monarchy would learn whether it could survive the scandal that had shaken it to its very foundation. The sentencing hearing drew even larger crowds than the trial itself. Every hotel in central London was booked solid as people traveled from across Britain and around the world to witness this historic moment. The area around the Old Bailey resembled a festival, with food vendors, souvenir sellers, and protesters creating a carnival atmosphere around what would be a somber day of justice. Judge Margaret Thornton had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment. Sentencing a queen consort was unprecedented in modern legal history. She had consulted with legal scholars, constitutional experts, and even historians to ensure that her decision would be both legally sound and historically appropriate. Camilla entered the courtroom looking frail and defeated. The weeks in custody had taken their toll. Her hair had grown gray at the roots, and she seemed to have aged years in just months. The transformation from royal dignity to criminal defendant was complete and heartbreaking, even for those who supported her prosecution. The victim impact statements came first, and they were devastating. Margaret Thompson from the Children's Hospital spoke about the 15 children who had died while waiting for treatments that couldn't be provided due to budget cuts. Her voice broke as she read the names of each child, looking directly at Camilla with each one. Tommy Henderson, age 7, died waiting for heart surgery. Sarah Mitchell, age 4, died waiting for cancer treatment. Michael Roberts, age 9, died waiting for kidney dialysis. The list went on and on, each name representing a life cut short by Camilla's greed. David Park from the homeless shelter described the families who had frozen to death during the harsh winter because they couldn't expand their facilities. He told the story of an elderly war veteran named Albert Thompson who had died alone in the cold because there was no room in the shelter. Albert served his country for 25 years, David said, his voice shaking with emotion. He survived 2 wars and came home to die in a doorway because the woman he had sworn to serve as his queen had stolen the money meant to keep him warm. Social worker Amanda Reynolds spoke for the families who had been destroyed by the cuts to support services. Children had been taken into care because their parents couldn't access help. Disabled adults had lost their independence because assistance programs had been eliminated. Elderly people had died alone because community support workers had been laid off. Dr. Patricia Williams, a child psychologist, testified about the psychological impact on young victims. Children had been traumatized not just by their illnesses but by the knowledge that help existed but wasn't available to them. Many had developed trust issues and anxiety disorders that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The prosecution presented evidence of the full scope of damage caused by Camilla's crimes. Beyond the immediate victims, entire communities had been affected. Local economies had suffered when charities couldn't employ staff. Volunteer programs had collapsed when funding disappeared. The ripple effects of her theft had touched thousands of lives. Sir Geoffrey Hamilton made a final plea for leniency, arguing that imprisonment would serve no purpose and that Camilla's royal status made her a special case. He suggested community service and restitution as alternatives to prison time. His arguments sounded hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence of harm. "Your Honor," Sir Geoffrey said desperately, "my client has already suffered greatly. She has lost her position, her reputation, and the respect of the nation. Surely that is punishment enough for someone of her age and status." But prosecutor Sir Marcus Webb rejected any suggestion of special treatment. He argued that Camilla's high position made her crimes worse, not better. She had betrayed not just the charities but the entire concept of public service and royal duty. "Your Honor," Sir Marcus stated firmly, "the defendant used her position of ultimate trust to commit these crimes. She exploited the respect and deference shown to the monarchy to steal from the most vulnerable members of society. This is not a case for mercy but for justice in its fullest measure." Judge Thornton asked Camilla if she wished to speak before sentencing. The courtroom fell silent as the convicted queen slowly stood. For a moment, it seemed she might maintain her silence. But then she began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. "I stand before this court not as Queen Camilla, but as a woman who has committed terrible crimes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I have no excuse for what I have done. No explanation can justify stealing from sick children and homeless families. I have betrayed not just my victims but my country, my family, and everything I was supposed to represent." She paused, looking directly at the victims' families in the gallery. Many were crying. But she continued, "I know that my apology cannot undo the harm I have caused. I know that sorry cannot bring back the children who died or ease the suffering of those who were left without help. I can only say that I am deeply, truly sorry, and that I accept full responsibility for my actions." The courtroom was completely silent as she sat down. Even her harshest critics were moved by what appeared to be genuine remorse. But the damage was too great, the crimes too severe, for words to matter much at this point. Judge Thornton spent 30 minutes reviewing the case, the evidence, and the impact on victims. She addressed the unprecedented nature of sentencing a queen consort but emphasized that the law applied equally to everyone. She spoke about the importance of public trust and the extra responsibility that came with high position. The defendant held the highest position of public trust in our nation, Judge Thornton said solemnly. She was expected to be a moral example and a protector of the vulnerable. Instead, she exploited her position to commit systematic theft from those most in need of help. The judge reviewed the aggravating factors, the scale of the theft, the vulnerability of the victims, the abuse of position, and the sophisticated planning involved. She noted that while Camilla had shown remorse, this could not outweigh the severity of the crimes and their impact. The sentence must reflect not only the harm done but also the need to maintain public confidence in the justice system, Judge Thornton continued. No one, regardless of position or title, is above the law. The Crown itself demands that justice be done. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Judge Thornton looked directly at Camilla and delivered the sentence that would echo through history. Camilla Elizabeth Mountbatten Windsor, you are hereby sentenced to 12 years imprisonment for theft, fraud, and money laundering. You are also ordered to pay full restitution of £8 million plus interest and legal costs. The courtroom exploded. Cheers, gasps, and cries filled the air as people reacted to the historic sentence. 12 years was more than many had expected, reflecting the severity of the judge's condemnation. Guards moved quickly to maintain order as emotions overflowed. Camilla showed no reaction to the sentence. She sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead as if she had expected this outcome. Her legal team immediately indicated they would appeal, but legal experts suggested the conviction and sentence were too solid to be overturned. Outside the courthouse, the crowds erupted in celebration. Thousands of people cheered and applauded as news of the sentence spread. The sound could be heard for miles as car horns honked and people sang and danced in the streets. It was like a national holiday celebrating justice finally being served. The scenes were broadcast live around the world. In Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, crowds gathered in public squares to watch the sentencing. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive, with many seeing it as proof that even the most powerful people could be held accountable. King Charles issued a brief statement from Australia, expressing his sadness about the situation, but supporting the rule of law. Palace sources suggested he was devastated by his wife's crimes and sentence, but recognized that justice had to take its course. Plans for his return to Britain were kept secret due to security concerns. As guards prepared to lead Camilla away to begin her sentence, she turned one last time to look at the courtroom. The victims' families watched her with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it could not undo the damage she had caused or bring back those who had died. The walk from the courthouse to the prison van was surrounded by massive crowds held back by police barriers. Some people booed and shouted, others applauded, and many simply stood in silent witness to this unprecedented moment in British history. Photographers captured every step of the journey that would define her legacy. At Holloway Prison, Camilla was processed like any other new inmate. The crown jewels were replaced with prison clothes, the royal apartments exchanged for a small cell. The woman who had once lived in palaces would spend the next 12 years in a 6-by-8-foot room. The immediate aftermath of the sentencing was chaotic and far-reaching. Parliament was recalled for an emergency session to discuss the constitutional implications. The Prime Minister addressed the nation, calling it a dark day for Britain, but a triumph for justice and the rule of law. Opinion polls showed the public overwhelmingly supported the sentence, with 85% saying it was appropriate or too lenient. Only a small minority thought it was too harsh. The justice system's reputation, which had been questioned for decades, was suddenly restored by this demonstration of equal treatment under law. Commonwealth nations moved quickly to distance themselves from the British monarchy. Within days of the sentencing, 3 countries announced plans to become republics. Others began constitutional reviews that would likely lead to the same conclusion. The scandal had accelerated the end of the British Empire's last remnants. The charities affected by Camilla's theft began the long process of rebuilding. Donations poured in from around the world, as people were inspired by the victims' dignity and courage. The Children's Hospital received enough funding to not only reopen the closed wing but expand their services. The homeless shelter was able to triple its capacity. 10-year-old Emma Williams, whose testimony had been so powerful during the trial, received her heart surgery within a week of the sentencing. The operation was successful, and she became a symbol of hope rising from tragedy. Her recovery inspired millions and showed that justice could lead to healing. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell was promoted and received commendations for her work on the case. She had proven that no one was beyond the reach of justice and that dedication to truth could overcome any obstacle. Her investigation became a textbook example of thorough, impartial police work. The monarchy itself faced an uncertain future. King Charles returned to Britain to find a nation questioning whether the royal family should continue to exist. Public support had plummeted, and politicians who had never dared criticize the monarchy were openly calling for its abolition. A national commission was established to review the future of the monarchy and its role in modern Britain. Constitutional experts, historians, and ordinary citizens were asked to consider whether an institution that had produced such corruption could be reformed or should be replaced entirely. But in the immediate aftermath of the sentencing, there was a sense of catharsis and justice that transcended political considerations. The victims had been heard, the perpetrator had been punished, and the law had proven itself stronger than privilege and power. As Camilla began her first night in prison, she could hear the distant sounds of celebration still echoing through London. The court had indeed exploded in cheers, as guards led her away in shackles. And those cheers represented something profound: the triumph of justice over privilege, of truth over power, and of the rights of the vulnerable over the greed of the elite. The story of Queen Camilla's fall would be told for generations as a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful or privileged, is above the law. It marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new understanding of justice, accountability, and the true meaning of public service in a democratic society.